Your 3D printer is trying to kill you.
Forever chemicals.
Forever chemicals.
If these so-called forever chemicals, known officially as PFAS, don't break down easily in the environment or our bodies, and they have been linked to issues like low birth weight, thyroid disease, and cancer.
And the worst part? Almost everyone is ignoring it. As far as inconvenient truths go, this is a big one. Factories have long been at the center of some of the biggest health scandals in history, from asbestos exposure to toxic chemical spills. That's why we have entire government health agencies like OSHA to oversee their activity and keep workers safe. But what happens when the factory isn't across town? Instead, it's sitting right on your desk, unregulated, unfiltered, silently releasing toxins into the same air your family breathes. We're about to uncover just how bad the problem really is and what you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones before it's too late. Now, I'd like to think this is the most important topic I've covered in my time on YouTube, but I'll let you decide. It's certainly the most challenging issue I've tackled, one that forced me to reconsider the very principles I've held about innovation and the risks we often overlook in its pursuit. In just 7 years, the global 3D printing market tripled from $4.4 billion in 2014 to $14.1 billion in 2021, with the US responsible for more than a fifth of that growth. In this era of rapid accelerationism, innovation marches on, but let's be real, health and safety often get left behind. And we're no longer in an era where we can fully trust the government to have our backs. The products we use are evolving, and so are the risks. We're now buying gadgets from AliExpress and Temu, or wearing clothes from brands like Zara that source materials from halfway across the world, places where regulations can be inconsistent. Remember DuPont's $670 million lawsuit over toxic chemicals? Even Amazon isn't off the hook. They've been accused of mixing legitimate products with counterfeit ones from who knows where. But it's not all bad news. The key here is being proactive, taking charge of the choices we make, or in the eternal words of Jamie Lee Curtis, making good choices, which is my goal here, to make sure you don't make mistakes you might regret. Now, while I don't run a 3D printer in my 2-bedroom apartment here in Brickell, I've been deep in this world. I've promoted products with schematics you can download off sites like Printables, and I've partnered with companies like JLC PCB to bring my own ideas to life, experimenting with dozens of advanced materials like nylons, PLAs, SLA resins, and even stainless steel. I've used 3D print farms overseas in China, as well as stateside services like CraftCloud. And here's what's become clear to me. 3D printing is no longer just for prototyping or even a passing novelty. It's a booming space with limitless potential. And trust me, once AI tools like ChatGPT can interpret .stl schematics, it'll be like throwing fuel on an already roaring fire. But with all this growth comes not only incredible opportunities, but also risks we can't afford to overlook. And that's exactly why this video matters right now. But which 3D printers pose the biggest risks, and just how bad is the problem at hand? Let's start with the obvious culprit: resin printers. By now, anyone familiar with 3D printing knows that resin is straight up toxic. It can burn through latex gloves and with repeated exposure sensitize you to severe allergies over time. One study even tested resin exposure on zebrafish embryos with grim results. Embryo death in most cases, and for the few that survived, 100% showed developmental abnormalities. Lovely, right? But here's the thing. This isn't exactly breaking news. Most people in the community know resin comes with significant risks and take precautions, or at least they should. Where it gets murkier and far more dangerous is with FDM printers. Now, conventional wisdom tells us PLA is safe. But the truth is, these filaments are releasing noxious fumes into your air every time you hit print. And if you tap 3D printing communities like Reddit and ask, how toxic are 3D printers really? You're gonna get a lot of mixed answers because nobody actually knows. But in order to solve it, we gotta understand what we're up against. So what's really happening when we heat up these filaments? Now, all 3D printers give off either VOCs, volatile organic compounds, microplastics, or both. And that's because a 3D printer and the accompanying filaments, even when used correctly, produce emissions. And as a side note, if you think microplastics are just in the ocean, think again. They're in our blood.
Plastics are everywhere. Every week, without even realizing it, we are consuming the equivalent of an entire credit card in plastic.
Health effects include headaches, loss of coordination, nausea, and damage to the liver, kidney, and central nervous systems. Some can cause cancer in animals. Some are suspected or known to cause cancer in humans. Key signs or symptoms associated with exposure to VOCs include conjunctival irritation, nose and throat discomfort, headache, allergic skin reactions, nausea, vomiting, nose bleeding, fatigue, and dizziness. VOCs further subdivide into classes that can run the gamut from benign, like VOCs emitted from, say, a flower, all the way to toxic, like, say, the ones generated by a laser printer. With this variation of VOC subtypes, we don't know the exact impact of each, but we do know that in some cases, it's not good. When I started researching this, I stumbled across some eye-opening stories from other makers online. It's easy to dismiss health warnings when they feel abstract, but these real-life experiences hit differently. Take this Redditor, for example. He said he's been printing PLA for 3 weeks in his condo lately and went to the ER twice because he felt woozy and almost passed out. Once it happened at work, and once it was while he was driving. Then there's this person who shared that they got a bleeding nose for days after using a PLA 3D printer, and apparently it messed up their sinus mucus production. And then another commenter on YouTube mentioned that he was diagnosed with bladder cancer, and the first question the doctor asked him was whether he worked with industrial chemicals. Exposure to toxic chemicals is the #1 reason for bladder cancer, and although he didn't work with industrial chemicals, he did spend a lot of time printing various plastics. These stories are anecdotal, sure, but they show a pattern. People are experiencing real health issues that might be tied to exposure from 3D printing. And as for the long-term effects, we really have no idea. The next concern is ultra-fine particles, or UFPs. The main exposure to UFPs is through inhalation. Owing to their size, UFPs are considered to be respirable particles. Contrary to the behavior of inhaled PM10 and PM2.5, ultrafine particles are deposited in the lungs, where they have the ability to penetrate tissue and be absorbed directly into the bloodstream, and therefore are not easily removed from the bodies and may not have immediate effect. Exposure to UFPs, even if components are not very toxic, may cause inflammatory mediator release and could induce heart disease, lung disease, and other systemic effects. A robust association has been observed between fine particulate levels and lung cancer and cardiopulmonary disease. The exact mechanism through which UFP exposure leads to health effects remains to be elucidated, but effects on blood pressure may play a role. And then that leaves microplastics, which is a concern, but the level of concern is debatable. Microplastics entered the radar as a health hazard for those who work around photocopiers, thus the research is pretty mature. There is some health impact for constant exposure, however, health impact is significantly lower than, say, burning wood for heat, cooking on a gas range top, barbecuing, using paint, sanding, or putting up drywall. And you can't rely on whether or not it smells as a check for toxic fumes. Many have no scent. Think of carbon monoxide. We can't smell that and it kills us all the same. Same deal with a bunch of other VOCs printers can spit out. Whether you can see or smell is not relevant at all when discussing toxicity. However, all FDM printing spews microplastics into the air, without exception, and we don't know the long-term effects of having those in our blood. A lot of people online are happy 3D printing in their bedrooms and report no ill effects, but in truth, we don't yet know the long-term effects of this stuff. People talk about headaches or allergies, but to me, that's not even my concern. I'm more worried about long-term health effects several years down the road. Finally, no filter filament is guaranteed food safe, even if the base material itself is considered harmless. The issue lies in the very nature of 3D printing, because it creates porous surfaces where bacteria can easily collect and thrive. And while food-safe UV resins and other coatings are available, they only offer partial solutions. Even printing molds for casting silicone, which can be food safe, requires thorough cleaning to minimize risks. Bacteria will grow on almost any surface that comes in contact with moisture, including 3D printed objects. Killing these bacteria presents its own challenges because heat high enough to kill bacteria will also deform materials like PLA. Radiation strong enough to sterilize will degrade the plastic and could harm you without extreme precautions. And chemical effective options may not be safe or readily available for use on printed plastics. Ultimately, if a 3D printed object comes in contact with food, bacteria will grow, and removing it without damaging the material is nearly impossible. This is why using 3D printed items for food should be approached with extreme caution or avoided altogether. Now, the most damning anecdote I uncovered while researching this video is a recent study published on PubMed Central that documented 3 high school teachers who developed rare and aggressive cancers, sarcomas, after prolonged exposure to 3D printer fumes. Tragically, all 3 teachers passed away. They had spent years working in poorly ventilated classrooms, regularly using PLAs and ABS filaments. None of them had any family or personal history of illness that could explain the diagnoses. And although this is correlation and not provably causation, the shared factor in all 3 cases was long-term exposure to 3D printing emissions in confined, unventilated rooms. While the study doesn't definitively prove that the fumes caused the cancer, the connection raises significant concerns. This story definitely gives me pause, and my condolences go out to those directly affected. But maybe heeding their experience is one of the best things we can do. I mentioned before that I'm not 3D printing here in my 1,000 square foot apartment in Brickell, although companies like Bamboo have offered to provide me with these products. But my partner and I are pretty forward-leaning when it comes to removing toxicity from our environment and foods. We utilize things like water filters, glass water bottles, zinc oxide sunscreen, and UV blocking apparel. Occasionally, I have to do some soldering, and I'm always mindful to direct the fumes away from my nose. We even have an app called Yuka, which we use when grocery shopping, that tells you which foods contain potentially carcinogenic additives in real time as we shop, just by scanning the barcode. And for some people in certain positions, these precautions are more important than for others. For instance, research I found said developing lungs are disproportionately affected by these kinds of toxins as opposed to, say, adults. And if individuals are in a phase of their life where they're expecting to have a child or want to, say, enhance fertility, elimination of toxins becomes even more vital. Now, when we talk about the hazards of 3D printing, the focus often falls on the printers themselves, but the real story lies in the materials we feed them. Each filament type has unique properties, but all share a hidden cost, the harmful byproducts released during printing. Now, the most common used filaments are ABS, PLA, PETG, and TPU. Let's break these down. Acrylonitrile butadiene styrene, or ABS, is a synthetic petrochemical that should come with a clear warning label. It's the same plastic used in Legos, and it emits 200 to 300 times more nanoparticles than other leading materials. These nanoparticles, also called ultrafine particles or UFPs, make it the most emissive filament. It has a distinctive smell when printing that's unpleasant and indicative of certain harmful chemicals like aldehydes, acetone, and styrene. These are hardcore carcinogens and CNS toxins, the kind of substances you'd never willingly bring into your home. Styrene in particular has been linked to dizziness, fatigue, and long-term health risks. One high-profile example actually stems from someone I greatly admire, David Heinemeier Hansson, the founder of programming framework Ruby on Rails. After building his luxury house in Malibu, his wife began to get sick with symptoms of dizziness and blurred vision. And after a lengthy trial, they discovered that the walk-in closet was leaching toxic levels of formaldehyde, which was causing her symptoms. He's now pretty outspoken about the importance of air quality, and I'll link a fascinating talk he gave on the topic below. The next filament commonly used is PETG, or polyethylene terephthalate glycol, and it's earned a reputation as a versatile and durable filament. It's stronger and more flexible than PLA, and it offers excellent shock resistance. It's also generally easy to print with. For many makers, PETG strikes a balance between printability and performance, making it a go-to material for functional parts and prototypes. But how safe is it really? PETG is often seen as slightly less safe than PLA, but the science behind this perception is sparse. One area of concern is its potential to release endocrine disruptors such as glycol and urethane, the same compounds found in substances like antifreeze. While these emissions are not as prominent as those from ABS, they still warrant caution. When heated during printing, PETG emits both ultrafine particles and volatile organic compounds. The levels of UFPs emitted by PETG are similar to PLA. Studies suggest that PETG's VOC emissions are relatively low compared to other filaments like ABS. However, the exact chemical makeup of PETG can vary by manufacturer, meaning some formulations may be safer than others. While PETG is generally perceived as a safer option than ABS, it's still not without risks. Ventilation is strongly recommended to minimize exposure to any harmful byproducts, especially for prolonged printing sessions. For now, PETG appears to be a reliable and moderately safe filament choice. But as with all 3D printing materials, using it responsibly with proper precautions is key. The next filament is thermoplastic polyurethane, also known as TPU, and it's a standout among 3D printing filaments thanks to its flexibility, durability, and biocompatibility. It's the material of choice for applications where elasticity and toughness are essential, such as phone cases, wearables, or hinges. One of TPU's most appealing features is its classification as biocompatible. This means it can safely come in contact with skin or other tissues, making it a popular choice for medical devices and personal protective equipment. Unlike many other filaments, TPU's material properties suggest that long-term exposure poses no harmful health risks under normal usage. And because of its flexibility and resilience, TPU excels in specialized applications, medical use, prosthetics, orthotics, and other medical devices. While TPU offers impressive safety and performance, proper ventilation is still recommended during printing. This is not because of the material itself, but to minimize exposure to any emissions that may occur during the melting process. Finally, there's polylactic acid, or PLA, and this is where things start to get murkier. Because on paper, it sounds like the darling of 3D printing filaments, a bioplastic made from corn, biodegradable, and even digestible by bacteria. It's marketed as the least toxic and most eco-friendly option out there. But as we've seen before, the devil's in the details. First off, the idea that a plastic derived from corn is automatically eco-friendly and non-toxic is a flawed assumption. Many natural substances can become harmful, especially when aerosolized and inhaled into the lungs. Wood dust, for example, is a well-known respiratory irritant despite being a natural material. And this kind of greenwashing is creating a false sense of security in the 3D printing space. That being said, on the 3D printing filament toxicity spectrum, PLA is on the safer side relative to the other options we have today. It's a low-emission filament compared to ABS, and pure PLA isn't itself toxic. And that's what many of the scientific papers use, pure PLA. Unfortunately, if you're printing PLA, it's almost guaranteed you're not printing pure PLA. In fact, most of the time it's only about 80% starch. The rest is usually a mix of stuff to hold it all together, including pigments, dyes, lubricants, and other additives to the base filament. And manufacturers are only getting more bold in what they're adding to filament composites, with new materials like carbon fiber, silicon, and even wood. Often marketed as PLA+, nobody but manufacturers know what the additives are which make it the plus. And each company changes it up to create their own proprietary blend. And I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that whatever it is that makes some filaments glow in the dark probably isn't safe to have circulating in our bodies. Some say to simply read the material safety data sheet for your filament, but I checked these and they don't tell you what other additives are in the filaments. And that's because 3D printing filaments operate in a regulatory gray area with little oversight from governing bodies in the EU or the US. And while the EU has stricter chemical regulations like REACH, compliance for filaments is often voluntary. And in the US, there are no universal safety standards unless a product explicitly claims to meet them. This leaves consumers relying on manufacturer limited disclosures and vague claims about safety. The Toxic Substance Controls Act, overseen by the EPA, requires manufacturers to submit safety data for new chemicals before they are used in consumer products. However, chemicals already on the TSCA inventory don't require additional testing, even if they're included as additives in 3D printing filaments. Manufacturers aren't obligated to disclose what additives they use unless classified as hazardous, often citing restrictive proprietary formulations to protect trade secrets. And while this caginess is somewhat understandable, the lack of transparency creates a gap in understanding potential health risks. And when it comes to safety, protecting user health should take priority. The TSCA also doesn't regulate the emissions created when these materials are heated, such as VOCs or ultrafine particles, leaving hobbyists reliant on manufacturers' claims with little to no accountability. So yeah, filament formulas are a bit of the wild, wild west right now. It's not just the filament you need to worry about. Your printer itself can introduce risks. Enter PFAS, the infamous forever chemicals. Known for their durability and resistance to degradation, PFAS are widely used in 3D printer components such as Bowden tubes and certain nozzles. These materials are prized for their non-stick and heat-resistant properties, but they come with a significant downside. Over time, wear and tear on parts like the Bowden tubes and nozzles can introduce trace amounts of unwanted materials into your prints. Brass nozzles, for instance, can release lead, while PFAS from PTFE-lined tubes can leach into your environment or your printed objects. If you're unfamiliar with PFAS, they've been linked to severe health and environmental issues, including hormonal disruption, immune system suppression, and cancer. And once these chemicals are in your system, they're nearly impossible to remove. The reality is this: every part of your 3D printer that touches the filament has the potential to contribute unseen risks. While PFAS-free component exists, they're not yet standard, meaning most users are unknowingly interacting with these substances every time they print. But after painting that grim picture, I'm not just gonna leave you hanging, because we do have options to enjoy our hobby without being in total denial. This is my tier list to keep you and your family safe. The first step, in my opinion, is to know your air quality. The indie tech space is actively pushing out microcontroller sensors, which are capable of detecting temperature, humidity, CO2, formaldehyde, total VOC, and PM 2.5. So if you're a nerd like me, you could build your own open source air quality monitor using something like the Seed Studio SenseCap indicator. Now, the engineers at Seed Studio sent me this device, which was originally intended for Meshtastic communication, but I upcycled it into an air quality monitor by adding an external particulate sensor. Okay, so if you buy one of these guys, just make sure that you get one that comes with the TVOC or CO2 sensor. You want the D1S or the D1 Pro, and it will automatically come with the air quality monitor software. Now, I had the D1L, which is made for Meshtastic, and you can see here the OS that's on this is Meshtastic. So I need to flash the air quality control firmware. to this device here. So the way you do that is we use a tool called ESP-IDF. We also download the open source software from GitHub. So the library for that is right here. One of the things I like about Seed Studio is everything is open source. So you can say, oh, it's coming from China, and you'd be correct, but the code is also transparent. So if there's anything nefarious going on, it would be visible. So the software we want here is the SenseCap Indicator ESP32. I already went ahead and downloaded that via Warp. So I'm in the terminal here, and within this directory, there's going to be different kind of flavors of the software. We want the indicator basis. So I'm going to go into indicator basis, and I'm going to use the ESP-IDF tool to build and flash the firmware to the device. So I need to find the port of my device. So I'm going to run this, and I have a couple different things here. What we want is 2110. So the thing about this device is it actually has two MCUs. It has a Raspberry Pi 2040 and an ESP32. We want to use the ESP32 for the primary firmware. So that's 2110. So if I go back over to Warp, that's going to be this guy right here. So now when I do my build command, I just need to use that. All right, so actually we need to build and flash. So let me see if I can't build this first. All right, and then to flash, let's see, I think this is what we want to flash. All right, if it says it's writing like this, that's usually a good sign. We see this screen go blank. Let's see if it doesn't boot up properly. Okay, and now we can see the air quality control software, and it's going to ask me to connect to my Wi-Fi network. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can also see in the topology report in my router settings, I can see this new device. So it is in fact connected to my router. It's on a special protected network. But if we go to this panel here, now we can see a CO2 projection, a total VOC projection, as well as temperature and humidity. And now for the fun part, testing the sensor. So since my version of the SenseCap doesn't come with built-in sensors, I'm going to use this external Grove SGP30 sensor with VOC and CO2 monitoring. Now it connects to the SenseCap via the I2C port easily enough. I also augmented the software to only monitor the VOCs, so we won't see the other readings change. Now, word on the street is that these Grove VOC sensors are particularly sensitive to alcohols like ethanol. So I'm going to pour some 91% isopropyl onto a cotton swab and seal it with the sensor inside this Tupperware container. As we close the environment, you can see the VOC index climbing pretty quickly, just like we expected. I'll speed this up for a bit of dramatic effect, but you get the point. This thing picks up VOCs in real time. Now to verify the accuracy, I'm going to remove the alcohol and let the sensor stabilize. Sure enough, the VOC levels drop back to baseline. This confirms the Arduino algorithm behind the sensor is doing its job. And while I didn't write the code myself, it's designed to process complex VOC data and give you actionable feedback, which makes it both practical and helpful. Now, you might be thinking that's great for isopropyl, but what about real-world scenarios? Well, imagine a classroom with a 3D printer quietly puffing out VOCs and microplastics into the same air the students breathe, or a side hustle where you're building custom 3D printed products to ship through Etsy but haven't factored in ventilation safety. Because when you're running a mini factory at home, there's no OSHA to protect you, but devices like these can. These scenarios hit closer to home than we'd like to admit, and without manufacturers like Seed Studio or Grove, this kind of tech might still be confined to research labs or reserved for the hands of big corporations. Instead, they've democratized it, making affordable, precise tools that empower everyday people to take control of what they breathe, which is just the kind of innovation this channel stands for. If you want one of these guys to monitor and hack on your air quality, you're going to want the D1 Pro or the D1S, and I'll leave a link in the description below, along with a $5 coupon. A few other build options would include nabbing one of these peripheral boards with a baked-on sensor. This is the Waveshare sporting the SGP40 VOC sensor, which is the same sensor used in the SenseCap D1 indicator and elsewhere. Grove makes a similar peripheral, and what I like about these is that these chips go for for about $17.50, and they can easily be used with microcontrollers like ESP32, Arduino, or even a Raspberry Pi, and they will immediately give you feedback around VOCs in your home. The SGP40 measures VOC, while the SGP30 measures VOC and CO2. CO2 often comes from crowded rooms and are a result of poor ventilation, but high concentrations of CO2 have been proven to have cognitive and respiratory impacts on humans. And finally, the SGP41 measures VOC and NOx, or nitrogen oxides. These gases can come from a variety of sources such as cleaning products, paints, cooking fumes, and can accumulate to dangerous levels in poorly ventilated indoor spaces. You'll also come across some other chips like the CJ-MCU 1100, which claims to detect formaldehyde and benzene. One thing to keep in mind about this is that they measure relative values, not absolute values. As a result, they rely on pretty extensive programs to both calibrate and execute an algorithm to give you values and their directional changes over time. All that code is readily packaged in Arduino libraries, so don't worry, but it's good to know how these things actually work. But if you're leaning towards buying instead of building, there are other off-the-shelf air quality monitors you can get. However, David Heinemeier Hansson, which I mentioned before, found in his research that many were frankly inaccurate. He tested about a dozen consumer air quality monitors alongside industrial grade equipment, as well as receiving help from on-site technicians who came to check those values. And he found most of the consumer stuff just wasn't accurate. But he did find that the Aware products actually seemed to work in line with some of the more high-end gear. And ultimately, he settled on scattering about 10 of these throughout his newly built home in Malibu. This device outputs a total score representing a composite of all the air quality input factors it's able to detect. It's easy to view and gamifies the whole process a bit, which I think encourages healthier habits. Next is enclosure and ventilation. So once we have optics around air quality, we may want to do something about it. Now, simply opening a window now and then is probably going to get you 80% of the way there. Now, how to implement a venting system really varies. I've seen some buy simple enclosures with an inline fan and call it a day. Others use small grow tent setups for their prints. When I solder my microcontrollers, I use a Kodo mini fan to direct the fumes away from my nostrils. Before using this fan, I have experienced headaches, and a friend of mine had experienced nasal bleeding with some of the soldering he's done. So I'm wary of the health effects. Also, as a bonus, some even claim that certain ventilation systems can improve the prints themselves. And since ventilation is so key, please don't put your 3D printer in a library, classroom, or dorm without proper airflow. Now you might be asking, doesn't shooting it outside just make it someone else's problem? And the answer is more or less, but at least you're keeping yourself safe for the time being until further innovation can be made with healthy filaments. Then there's filtration options. Sometimes ventilation isn't feasible, whether it's due to space constraints or environmental factors. In those cases, filtration systems can serve as a backup solution. They're certainly better than nothing, but let's be clear, they're not a substitute for proper ventilation. When it comes to filtering air, you'll encounter two main options: HEPA filters and carbon filters. Now, we've all heard of HEPA, which stands for high efficiency particulate air, and this is a filter rated to remove at least 99.97% of particles that are 300 nanometers in diameter, including dust, pollen, and spores. These are great for capturing larger particles, but on paper, they fall short when it comes to ultra-fine particles produced by 3D printers. While HEPA filters effectively trap particles over 100 nanometers, most UFPs from 3D printing measure between 15 and 65 nanometers, meaning in theory they can pass right through the filter. They also don't tackle VOCs. They're better for dust emitted from, say, sanding. But a study conducted in France did show that HEPA filters worked with smaller particles due to Brownian motion and van der Waals forces. It's just important to note that they are not built for those purposes nor guaranteed. And also, please exercise caution because many low-cost HEPA filters sold on platforms like Amazon, Temu, and AliExpress might not meet true HEPA standards. Then there's carbon filters, and these are ideal for reducing VOCs, which are common emissions from heated filaments. However, effectiveness depends heavily on the filter's placement, quality, and maintenance. Regular testing is recommended to ensure your setup is actually removing harmful VOCs. If ventilation isn't an option, or you're looking for a low-cost way to improve air quality, the Corsi Rosenthal box might be your answer. A study from Brown University found that these DIY air filters made from MERV 13 filters and a box fan reduced harmful chemicals like PFAS and phthalates by up to 60% for just $100 and a bit of duct tape. You could significantly cut down on airborne toxins while also protecting yourself from ultrafine particles. It's a simple, scalable solution that fits perfectly into any maker's toolkit. There also exist DIY filters that run right in the 3D printer, which I like because it gets the particles before they get leached into your rooms, like this bento box shown here. Now, David Heinemeier Hansson ultimately landed on the Allen Breathe Smart as a good option because it cleaned the air with almost no sound. While filtration systems are helpful in reducing exposure, they work better as part of a broader strategy that prioritizes ventilation wherever possible. Always test and refine your setup to ensure you're getting the protection you need. Next is the filaments. To reduce your risk, stick to low-emission materials like PLA, PETG, or TPU whenever possible. These filaments are much safer alternatives to high-risk options like ABS and resin. ABS, while durable, emits styrene and other cancerous carcinogens. And for me, I would just skip resin, but if you're gonna use it, resin requires strict safety measures including enclosures and PPE due to its hazardous fumes. For me, I'd say instead choose PLA or PETG for everyday projects. PLA is beginner friendly and widely considered the safest filament, while PETG offers added strength and flexibility without significantly increasing emissions. For an even cleaner option, look for natural or unadulterated PLAs from manufacturers that minimize additives. These small adjustments can make a big difference in reducing your exposure while still delivering excellent print results. But beyond all this, there's still one other option that, in my opinion, might be the best fit for some of you, and it's my little secret when it comes to 3D printing. That is outsourcing. There are a number of print farm services that, similar to PCB manufacturers, allow you to upload your .stl files, select the colors, materials, and quantities, and simply remote print your builds. They then ship them directly to your door. In my experience, these services like Xometry, CraftCloud, or JLC 3D printing ensure professional grade results. Turnaround times are often very reasonable, usually on the order of 7 to 14 days. They're also pretty cheap. And one of the best things is, if you do want to be more enterprising and scale up a product for, say, Etsy, these facilities can handle larger volumes than you'd ever be able to print at home. And this is exactly what I did recently with a project that I'm really excited about. The Houdini M1, an open source, no subscription, Meshtastic-based dog tracker. Not only is it open source, but it works in remote areas without any cellular coverage, making it perfect for off-grid adventures with your dog. For this project, I needed to iterate quickly and experiment with different colors and filament types to strike the perfect balance between durability and flexibility for real-world use. That's where outsourcing 3D printing really shines. I used JLC PCB for this job. It was as simple as uploading my .stl files, and I was able to test both nylon and SLA resin prints to compare the results. The quality and precision were fantastic, and it saved me the time and effort of doing it all in-house. Outsourcing gives you access to advanced materials and industrial-grade accuracy. It also eliminates the need to maintain your own equipment or deal with health concerns from printing at home. And here's the best part. JLC PCB printed my design for as little as $2.36 per piece. Even with shipping, the total for my 2 prototype prints came to just $24.46. prints, which is ridiculously cheap for high quality 3D prints, especially using materials like nylon or SLA resin. From there, it's pretty easy to throw your creations on Etsy or wherever else you may want to sell them. I've even brokered a discount just for you with JLC PCB. If you're interested in the Houdini M1, I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check it out. It's a fantastic little device that opens up a ton of possibilities. Now, I certainly wouldn't tell you how to live your life. I can only share what I do. You'd be a fool to take medical advice from me, and I'd be a fool to offer it. But this ready, fire, aim approach to 3D printing feels eerily reminiscent of other cautionary tales. Teflon, leaded gas, asbestos, and cigarette smoking all come to mind. When it comes to the current state of 3D printing safety, the truth is we don't know what we don't know. At least once in every generation, society experiences a breakthrough so transformative that we soon can't imagine life without it. I believe 3D printing is one of these breakthroughs. It has the potential to be the great decentralizer, the bright spot in US-based manufacturing we've all been waiting for, which is a mission this channel fully supports. But not at the expense of our family's health. We need to face these risks with clear eyes and take manageable steps to mitigate them. After all, everything in life carries some level of risk. If you want to completely avoid toxins, well, you'd have to stop breathing. So what can you do? One is that you can share this video or make a donation to the cause associated in this video, but more importantly, take action to make your 3D printing setup safer for you and your loved ones. 3D printing gives us the power to create almost anything, but with great power comes even greater responsibility. Because in the end, the only thing you should be building is your next great idea, not long-term health problems. If I've gotten anything wrong, let me know in the comments, and if you're as excited about decentralization as I am, tap the video on the screen to check out my deep dive on Meshtastic devices, the so-called phone killers. It's my favorite piece of content I've made on YouTube, and I'd recommend watching it. Thanks.